is an understanding now, particularly within the biodynamic field, that there isn't only one rhythm, there are a number of rhythms. We are essentially polyrhythmic systems. There are rhythms within rhythms within rhythms. Typically, in this field of practice, we talk about 3 rhythms. I'm not sure that there are only 3, I suspect there are more, but there are 3 key rhythms that we find ourselves working with in craniosacral practice. And I would like to give a summary of what these rhythms are, but also a little discussion around what might also be underpinning these rhythms, what might be at their core, what might be at their center. And I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start, it's a little bit kind of inside out or back to front, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to just explore for a few minutes what might be underneath all of the rhythms that we talk about or work with in craniosacral practice. And I want to say also that what I'm talking to you about now is not, there is a theory here, but this is something that has been an understanding, I would say, that has been developed out of the experience of practitioners working within this field. Okay? It happens when you've got your hands on a patient and there is a settling and there is a slowing down. You may find yourself going to such a deep place, maybe there are movements at first, but then after a little while, it sometimes happens, and you may have experienced this anyway, not just in craniosacral practice, that you can come into contact with a deep stillness. And this is not just a kind of a temporary stopping of movement. This is not just a kind of holding back. This is not just things pausing. This is a really all-encompassing type of stillness. Dr. Becker, who was a student of Sutherland, termed this stillness dynamic stillness. And I like that phrase. I think it's a wonderful phrase because it also expresses the sense of potential, the sense of potency that can be present within this stillness. That this stillness somehow holds the full potential for whatever we are and whoever we are and however we function. I think this is very similar to an understanding that's been developed in some traditional forms of medicine and also in many spiritual forms. In Buddhist practice, for example, there is a Sanskrit word called Shunyata that is used to describe, often translated as emptiness. Having spoken to some Buddhist teachers and scholars around this, they say, well, yes, but the word emptiness is not a particularly good translation of this word shunyata because it also means luminosity. There's a sense of vitality. It's not just a vacuum, non-existent state. There is this sense of potential and presence that is there within the emptiness. Well, I suspect that this is something that craniosacral practitioners also tap into from time to time in their practices. I think it's also something that physicists are looking at. They're describing that at the core of everything there is emptiness. Things are not really what they appear to be. If we look at this table, it appears to be very solid, but the physicists, the quantum physicists will say, well, there's more space here in this piece of metal than there is anything else. This is just basically space. Yeah? which is also another word, another way that I've heard this term in Buddhism, Shunyata, been described as spaciousness. Okay? In physics, it's sometimes called the zero-point field. This is a quote from Stephen Hawking, from a book that he brought out a few years ago, when he says, a little bit of this is cut off, so let me just read this for you. The universe, in short, was spontaneously created out of nothing. Thus, all of us can trace our ancestry back to nothing. Okay? The universe, in short, was spontaneously created out of nothing. Thus, all of us can trace our ancestry back to nothing. So what he's saying is that everything emerges, everything we see and feel and touch in the universe emerges out of nothing. So if we want to go back to our roots, back to where we came from, there is this sense of nothing or spaciousness. Now, this, as I say, can be something that craniosacral practitioners may experience when it comes in to the room, when we're practicing, when it's something that occurs. One thing is almost guaranteed, and that is, if you really feel touched by this deeper stillness physiologically, at a cellular level, not only your consciousness feels touched by it, but your body feels touched by it as well. We never come out in the same way that we went in. It's like something changes. It's like something is able to reset. Sometimes I use the analogy, it's like, let's say your computer's not working and, you're having problems and you spend the next 20 minutes on the helpline trying to get through to somebody in the Philippines and, eventually they manage to get through, you manage to get through. What is the first thing they tell you to do? Turn it off and switch it back on again. And, that kind of cures a lot of things. Well, I think it's a good analogy because I think it works with us too. When we're able to just kind of really get to that place of feeling, connected to that place which is switched off, which is just being, not the doing, but just that sense of pure being. It's amazing what can reset, what can happen once we do that, when we start to come out of that. So we use this principle in biodynamic practice. We use this notion. Yeah? From this ground of stillness, Dr. Sutherland described this groundswell of the breath of life. It's like, life starts to express itself as motion, and it does this in a rhythmical way. And there is a very slow rhythmic movement which Dr. Becker coined, he called it the long tide, which takes about just over a minute and a half for one inhalation phase, for one phase to complete and the next phase to complete. It's about a minute and a half. Okay, so it's a very slow movement that we may feel. And it's something that when it happens in craniosacral practice, we don't just feel it in the body, we feel it in the field around us. Dr. Sutherland very poetically described the ocean of primary respiration. He saw primary respiration as being a force within the natural world around us. He saw that the planet is breathing, the natural world around us is breathing, and we ourselves are being breathed by that, by these subtle forces. So the long tide denotes this sense of not just, how we breathe as individuals, how we express primary respiration as individuals, but the sense of how this slow movement moves through us but that it's not personal. It's something transpersonal. It's something environmental as well. Okay? Now, if we're able to synchronize to this much wider field of breathing, which has been described in many different fields of practice as well, this is also synchronizing to a real core level of health, and one that can have great therapeutic possibilities. What we find in our practices is where this real slow movement starts to show itself, when it becomes available, when it becomes apparent. It changes things. You know, you might feel it moving through your body, or feel it through the body of your patient, and you can literally feel things starting to reorganize in response to that very slow tidal movement. So we learn skills, we learn perceptual skills, we learn therapeutic skills to synchronize with the long tide as a means of supporting its expression. We also express this potency, this breath of life, in very individual ways. The medium through which we do this in the body, the interface, is fluid. This same understanding is present in Chinese medicine, in Oriental medicine, where, you know, the blood, not only the blood, but all the fluids of the body are said to be the carriers of qi, this vital force. This same understanding is in craniosacral practice, that these wider forces of life are expressed through the fluids of the body. The fluids of the body are in some ways the carrier of these vital forces, helping to bring this organizing principle into kind of physiological use. Dr. Sutherland identified the significance and the importance of cerebrospinal fluid in that process. This individualized, we can say organismic expression of life generates a rhythmic movement that in cranial practice is referred to as the mid-tide. The mid-tide is a faster movement than the long tide. It averages about 2.5 cycles a minute for one phase of inhalation, breathing in, and one phase of exhalation to complete. It's a movement that is expressed throughout the whole body, through all the fluids in the body, all the tissues of the body. It's also something that we can feel within the field around the body, because there's also an understanding and an appreciation within biodynamic practice that we don't end at the skin. There's some of us, you know, that extends beyond the skin. There is a force, we can call it a potency. Dr. Becker referred to it as a biosphere, this sense of the wholeness of the individual that extends beyond the contours of the skin. This potency within the field around us is also expressing rhythmic motion and can be worked with. And then we have, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the cranial rhythmic impulse as this faster movement. This is where Sutherland started, this 8 to 12 cycles a minute. And there are different understandings as to what might be producing this, but I see this a little bit like, we can say, the boats on the surface of the ocean. You know, the individual tissues are like boats on the surface of the ocean, and according to which way the currents are going and which way the wind is blowing, you get these quite fast rhythmic movements on the surface of the ocean. But then as you drop down a little bit, you come into slower tidal movements. And as you drop down even further, or down towards the ocean floor, you might then be in an even slower movement. And perhaps the dynamic stillness is like the ocean floor itself. It's just that point of reference for everything. So there's a real brief summary of what we call the primary respiratory system, which is a system of rhythmic movement, of rhythmic motion, of different rates, different functions. And we can learn how to relate to these, how to work with these, how to synchronize to these different rhythms, and how to encourage, wherever possible, their healthy expression.